There was a really interesting period in our story when humanity had evolved in East Africa and we started dispersing and migrating around the entire planet. And we left our cradle about 65,000 years ago, walked into Eurasia, and the world back then was a very different place to what we are familiar with today. Because back then we were in the depths of the last ice age. And not only were the conditions punishingly cold, with kind of howling winds blowing across a kind of Siberian tundra-type landscape, but these kilometre-thick ice sheets sucked out so much water from the oceans that the sea levels dropped by up to about 120 metres. This exposed a lot of land that would have been seabed before. And our ancestors could simply walk most profoundly across the Bering Land Bridge from the kind of top eastern corner of Siberia right across to Alaska and therefore populate the entire Americas. And there'd been dispersals of human species out of Africa before. Homo erectus had reached as far as China. Neanderthals were inhabiting Europe at the time. But our ancestors, Homo sapiens, were the first humans to ever walk into the Americas. We'd walked where no hominin species had ever walked before. And then once we arrived there, about 20,000 years ago, the sea levels started to rise again with the easing of the last ice age. And these two halves of the world, kind of Eurasia and Africa in the east, and the Americas in the west, became separated. They were kind of dissected away from each other. And these two populations of humanity, which were essentially genetically identical, had the same access to features of planet Earth in terms of animals and plants to domesticate and raw materials to dig up and start using. We essentially had two independent experiments in inventing civilization and through the kind of course of civilization after that. And so this is one of those really deep facts of our history that has got a deep planetary cause behind it, but has had all this kind of flourishing of history and our story that flows out of that one simple fact.
Can I just ask, during that big exodus, the big migration of our species, did we come across the other hominid species and kill them all?
Well, we came across them and we were clearly quite friendly because we have interbred with them. Very friendly indeed.
Yeah.
So we can see in our own genome, in our own human DNA, the imprint, the signature of Neanderthal DNA. So we have interbred with Neanderthals and then carried their DNA with us as we then walked around the rest of the world. And we also interbred with another human species, one of our cousins. And all we know about this human species called the Denisovans has come from a few tiny fragments of finger bone, which have been preserved in a cave in Central Asia. And this entire species of humans living at the same time as we were moving through Asia is only known by some fragments of finger bone. That in itself blows my mind. And we can see, like I say, that kind of telltale signature left in our own genome, in our DNA.
It's amazing. Okay, so let's follow I mean, I'm a sucker for the old Eurasia and Africa versus the Americas thing because, of course, it all comes back to roost in the late 15th century. And then you get this unbelievable situation when the Spanish head over to Central America, and then within 150 years, 90% of this entire branch of the human race, as you say, this controlled experiment, are dead.
Yeah, so disease has been very, very important. And the isolation of these two human populations has been critical. And it was diseases like smallpox that were thought to have been taken across from Eurasia to the Americas. And the population in the Americas had never been exposed to this disease before and therefore had no inherited immunity and were absolutely decimated by it. But again, this comes down to a feature of the Earth. The reason Eurasians were immune to smallpox is because we had such great channels of communication across the entire continent. And this goes right back to the centuries of history of the Silk Roads and overland transport that I talk about in Origins in the book, as well as maritime trade across the Indian Ocean. We were so well connected throughout our history, and this allowed us to share not just silk and gold and physical things,
but plague,
but also ideas and also diseases. So we're one big melting pit of disease across Eurasia, and we became immune to them. We developed immunity to those diseases, which people in Americas did not. And so when these two great experiments in humanity came together again, the Americans did not have immunity to those diseases.
And also the nature quirk of geography is that north-south communication within the Americas is almost impossible. So the Incas and the Aztecs never knew each other.
Never came across each other, exactly.
That's mental.
So again, it's just, you look at a map and the thing that jumps out to you, and Jared Diamond made this point in Guns, Germs, Steel, is that Eurasia is an east-west continents, whereas the Americas are north-south. They're kind of vertical on the world map. And this has been fundamental because plants are easy to move, crops are easy to move along a line of latitude. They have similar seasons, similar climate. Plants don't like being moved north or south. They have to keep readapting to the changing seasons, that, fundamental things with plant growth, like the length of the day. So that simple planetary fact that the Americas happen to be aligned north-south held them back for thousands and thousands of years. They had less ability to move their crops around, therefore they had less access to different nutrition sources to support large cities and their civilizations.
Dude, humans the same. I'm a 50th latitude kind of guy. I freak out if I'm
You don't like the
north
tropics.
or south. Tropics find the far north a bit tricky as well. I'm just a sort of grey English sky kind of guy.
So I grew up in Kenya. So my own childhood was in the kind of Rift Valley, and where we had the cradle of our own species. So I was at school in Nairobi called the Banda, which is Swahili for mud hut. I went to the mud hut school in Nairobi in Kenya.
How cool. Then you exploded out of the...
And then I
valley.
Migrated and dispersed myself.
Yeah. And established friendly relations with Neanderthals here in the UK. Anyway, so this is... I'm trying to think about some of the big themes of history that are caused by geography and science and nature and things, and are sort of environmental factors rather than human factors. And one of them is the fact that we, despite all coming from the same place, we've ended up looking different, inventing different gods, inventing different national stories, and killing each other a lot.
Yes.
And presumably that is because we did things like crossed the land bridge to Kent, and then Doggerland and the English Channel flooded, or we've crossed into the Pyrenees. And those geographical boundaries have created communities.
Yeah, so people around the world do look differently, and this has been given the label of kind of different races of humanity. But when you look at the actual genetics, we are all so incredibly similar to each other. There is no fingerprint of race in the genome. It's absolutely negligible. And in fact, as I write in Origins, there's a greater genetic diversity between two troops of monkeys living on opposite sides of a river in Central Africa than there is in the entirety of the human, of all 7 billion of us around the world. And that in itself comes down to this population bottleneck as we spilled out. A few thousand of our ancestors spilled out of Africa and reproduced and populated the entire world. So the reason we are all so genetically similar is because this origin of coming out of Africa and then kind of dispersing around. And once we settle down, we then see these fascinating and recurring themes and trends throughout history, throughout these thousands of years of civilization. And one of the most important ones for Eurasia comes down to climate bands. And you have this region running along the spine of Eurasia, which are the steppes. They're a dry area where grass can grow, but not trees. And around the rim, around the margin of Eurasia, around kind of Southeast Asia, around Europe, you have a wetter climate which can support agriculture and farmers and civilization, and therefore all the kind of nation states that arose. And that fundamental tension between the steppes and horse riding nomads that spilled out recurringly, repeatedly through history. So the Huns spilled out and they threatened China. They spilled out a few hundred years and they threatened Europe and caused the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Mongols in the late 1300s spilled out and built the largest land empire that the world had ever seen from their base in the steppes. And all that tension between pastoralists, between nomad horse riders and settled farmers basically comes down to just a distinction of the ecology between dry grasslands and wet farming supporting areas. So that the Great Wall of China, which is obviously a defensive wall, it's to keep the barbarians out, to keep the people like the Changzhou out. But what it was actually doing was just tracing along the world map along that border, that ecological border between dry grasslands and wet farmland.
Okay, so then we got populations that look a bit different and are isolated and start to develop national stories, or certainly stories that give them identity. Why do some of them develop cities and pyramids and armies and religions, and some of them don't?
But I think, again, this comes back to what I was just talking about, that the fact that some peoples, some cultures developed civilizations isn't to kind of poo-poo people who remain nomadic. So the pastoralists across this enormous area along the backbone of Eurasia, these steppes, they're not less cultured than people in Europe or in China. They just have a fundamentally different mode of life that is imparted to them by the ecosystem they live in. That if you're living in a dry area, you can keep very large flocks of sheep, which provide your economic base, and you essentially just migrate back and forth with the seasons.
You can't stay in the same place.
You can't stay in the same place. If you're living in wetter areas, you can chuck some grain into the ground and then wait for it to kind of flourish, and you harvest it, and you feed yourself on those cereal crops. So throughout human history, all of humanity has been feeding itself on three main staples, which are wheat and rice in Eurasia and maize, corn in the Americas. So throughout human history, we've supported ourselves by eating grass. Like those cereal crops are species of grass. We eat grass in the same way that cows and sheep we leave out to pasture are. We are in that same biological mode. But we are held back by not having four stomachs like a cow. We want to eat grass because it grows fast and gives you good nutrition, but we can't actually digest it because our evolution has been different. So we've had to apply our brain.
So cruel.
You're thinking I'm being nasty today.
No, not you personally. I think the creator, man. I mean, what a disastrous plan not to allow humans to eat grass. I mean, it would have, a lot of great mass starvations would not have occurred.
Well, this is it. But I say in a way we do eat grass. We've just picked which species of grass to eat, and we've applied our brain to the problem because we couldn't apply our stomach, and that's why we invented things like the millstone, which is like a technological tooth that grinds the grain into flour. We bake bread out of it. You make rice noodles. So we've applied our brains, which were crafted by the rapidly fluctuating environment in East Africa as we evolved, to enable us to feed ourselves on a wide range of different plants and then build these civilizations and cities.
Okay, so we've spread everybody out. We've got them occasionally now a little bit isolated from each other. We've some of them they've all adapted to local circumstances to survive. Now, what about minerals? What about the things beneath their feet? When humans start to work out that they can harness rocks for both energy in terms of creating heat, which allows them to melt things, and then also ions. I mean, how important are the deposits of minerals, gold, things like that?
Yeah, so clearly very important, and the landscape gives us certain advantages. So a mountain range can protect you from invasion. So India, for example, was behind the wall of the Himalayas for a lot of history and was kind of protected in that sense, whereas different deposits of natural resources like iron ore or copper ore or a particular kind of sedimentary rock that we realised could burn very effectively, so we didn't have to keep coppicing forests. So coal clearly transformed our story, our history, and literally powered the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And so to pick that example of coal, we take it for granted, but there's a really weird thing that happened to provide that coal for us. So the coal that we dig up and have been burning since the Industrial Revolution dates back to largely in the Carboniferous era of our planet's history, so about 320 million years ago. And something broke with the Earth back then, that its recycling system broke down. Trees would grow, they'd fall over and die, but they would not rot. Something was stopping all of these trees for a very long period of time to not rot, so it could then build up into these great big peat deposits, which became coal. And then something happened more recently in the oceans during the Cretaceous, about 70 million years ago, where plankton, organisms in the oceans would grow, die, and not rot. And that created all the oil that we've been sucking up and powering our transport and our power stations with more recently. So even those kind of chapters in our Earth's history have been absolutely critical to our own history and how we operate the world today.
You mentioned oil. Are we now entering an era where I hesitate to say your thesis, because everyone's thesis, of course, it's correct, it's established fact, but where this idea that we are simply kind of clinging on to the scientific, genetic, geographical legacy of the Earth, are we entering a phase where that's less true because we can now build a colony on the moon and bring whatever, or in Nevada. so we can bring everything we need there, including the people, the food, the water, everything.
Yeah, I think so. So the premise for this book, for Origins, which I described in the introduction, is that today humanity is the dominant force on the planet. We are more influential on our planet than all of the natural environmental forces like kind of erosion and river transport. And so many geologists have therefore called that we should rename this current epoch as the Anthropocene, the modern age of humanity. We are the dominant force on the planet for all the things we've just been talking about, all the things I explore in the book that have enabled us to get where we are today. But that hasn't always been the case. Clearly, we've been crafted as a species and guided as peoples by different features of the Earth. So I wanted to explore that flip side of the story, which, as I say, I don't think gets as much attention from historians and people describing us.